All right, let's just jump right into this explainer because we're looking at a massive disruption right now. I mean, it's literally rewiring the economics of the entire artificial intelligence market. If you've been following the AI space over the last couple of years, you know the established playbook, right? The race for the absolute best performing model has basically been a story of massive computational budgets. We're talking billions of dollars poured into sprawling infrastructure. And naturally, those premium price tags eventually get passed down to you, the consumer, or the enterprise client. The assumption was always, top-tier intelligence requires top-tier capital. But wow, that script has just been violently flipped. So what happens to the AI market when top-tier coding performance becomes up to 34 times cheaper, practically overnight? It's a staggering question, isn't it? We're going to explore how an incredibly agile disruptor, DeepSeek, is just taking on massive industry incumbents, companies like OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic. And they're doing it by drastically undercutting their prices while remarkably matching their tech. This isn't just some minor price adjustment or a seasonal promotion, guys. This is a foundational shift in how we value and pay for AI. It forces us to ask, what happens to the whole software ecosystem when the smartest tech in the room suddenly goes on a permanent fire sale? Section 1. The AI price war and the resulting market shock. To really understand the scale of this market shock, we first need to look at how quickly this proprietary versus open source battle escalated over just a few short weeks. Okay, so on April 26th, DeepSeek drops their V4 model with what they called a temporary 75% promotional discount. Obviously, the industry takes immediate notice. Then we see the panic reaction. On May 19th, Google launches Gemini 3.5 Flash and simultaneously slashes their existing Gemini 3.1 Pro pricing by 25%, basically to try and stem the bleeding. But then comes the absolute knockout punch on May 24th. DeepSeek substantially ups the ante by making their 75% discount on the V4 Pro API completely permanent. So this initial promotional launch essentially forced a rapid defensive pricing reaction from Google, culminating in DeepSeek dictating an entirely new normal for the whole market. To put the sheer gravity of this into perspective, we have to look back slightly to earlier in the year. You might remember the January 2025 launch of DeepSeek R1 famously erased more than $1 trillion in market capitalization from U.S. stocks in a single day. $1 trillion. It sent absolute shockwaves through the financial sector, proving that a smaller, hyper-efficient team could actually threaten the massive moats of Silicon Valley's giants. But here's why we're talking about this today. While that previous launch caused unprecedented financial ripples, the V4 launch and its permanent price reduction is actually a much, much bigger deal. It's not just a warning shot anymore. It's a sustained, highly capable threat built on raw, undeniable performance. Section 2. Comparing the cost, V4 versus its competitors. Let's move to the actual numbers and see how this pricing structure builds just a staggering gap between DeepSeek and its Goliath competitors. 34 times. I really want that number to sink in for a second. At its most extreme, DeepSeek V4 is approximately 34 times cheaper on output generation compared to OpenAI's GPT 5.5 model. Now, if you're just a casual user chatting with an AI a few times a day, a few cents here or there, it might not matter. But when we're talking about millions upon millions of tokens being processed daily by enterprise applications, automated coding agents, and massive tech startups, a 34x difference completely changes the business model of a software company. It takes AI from being this carefully budgeted luxury to a near-limitless commodity. When we break down the sheer contrast in cost per million tokens, the reality becomes pretty stark. Let's look at the top tier. V4 Pro costs just 43.5 cents for fresh inputs, and if those inputs are cached, it costs an almost invisible fraction of a penny, $0.0036. And for the heavy lifting, the outputs, it's just 87 cents per million tokens. Now, contrast that directly with GPT 5.5, which demands $5 for inputs and a massive $30 for outputs. Opus 4.7 sits at $25 for outputs. The math is simply undeniable here. DeepSeek isn't just 34 times cheaper than GPT 5.5, it's also 29 times cheaper than Opus 4.7 and 14 times cheaper than Google's Gemini 3.1 Pro. The financial barrier to entry has completely evaporated. Moving to Section 3. But can it code? Let's look at the benchmark performance. Because a massive discount only matters if the technology actually works, right? Nobody wants a cheap tool if it breaks every time you try to use it. So how does V4 hold up in rigorous technical benchmarks against these expensive heavyweights? Well, in the human eval coding benchmark, DeepSeek V4 Pro achieves a super solid 90% score. It demonstrates top-tier, functional code generation, sitting right alongside the industry giants. We have GPT 5.5 leading slightly at 93.4% and Opus 4.7 at 92.1%.
But here's the absolute kicker. V4 is actually outperforming Google's Gemini 3.1, which scored 88.5%. Think about that. You are paying 14 times less than Gemini and getting a measurably higher score on this core evaluation. Incredible.
And why does verified software engineering matter compared to just basic coding? Well, because SW Bench tests an AI's ability to solve real-world complex GitHub issues, not just isolated toy logic problems. It is the ultimate proving ground for practical developer use. And in this arena, V4 Pro scores 80.6%. This virtually matches Anthropic's Claude Opus, which sits just a tiny fraction of a hair higher at 80.8%. And again, it comfortably beats Google's Gemini 3.1 Pro at 76.2%. So it's performing flawlessly in the exact same heavyweight classes models that cost exponentially more to operate, proving it has the real architectural depth to handle serious engineering workloads.
But it's not just pure coding either. The GPQ Diamond Advanced Reasoning Benchmark is notorious in the AI space. It consists of literal PhD-level questions in physics, biology, and chemistry that even highly educated human experts struggle with. And on this incredibly difficult test, DeepSeek V4 Pro reaches a 90.1% accuracy rate. Even in these highly advanced reasoning tasks, DeepSeek firmly holds its own in elite territory, trailing just slightly behind GPT 5.5 and Gemini 3.1 Pro. I mean, delivering a 90% accuracy rate on PhD-level science while costing literal pennies is nothing short of an engineering marvel.
Section 4. The developer verdict and real-world feedback. All right, stepping away from the sterile benchmark data for a second, what are real software developers actually experiencing with this model out in the wild? Coders impartially note a distinct divide in everyday application. On one hand, V4 handles endpoint logic, structured output, and heavy code-based tasks exceptionally well. It is an absolute workhorse for the daily grind of software creation. However, they also note it isn't completely flawless. It can occasionally struggle with context degradation over extremely long chat sessions, and it does fall slightly behind the more expensive models when it comes to really complex multi-file agentic tool coordination. So it has its limits, and developers are learning exactly where those boundaries are. But here is exactly where the rubber meets the road. If you have to refresh your context window occasionally, or maybe give the AI a slightly more explicit prompt, but in exchange, you are saving 97% on your overhead, is that a trade-off you're willing to make? Developers are overwhelmingly answering, absolutely yes. The overarching consensus from the community is that these minor performance gaps are entirely eclipsed by the monumental reduction in deployment costs. Startups and enterprise teams alike are just happily choosing to work around these slight limitations because honestly, the economics are far too attractive to ignore.
Section 5. The future of AI and the macroeconomic effects.
Let's zoom out a bit to understand the broader macroeconomic ripple effects this specific price war is about to trigger across the entire tech sector. We are looking at 4 massive shifts. First off, we can absolutely expect heavyweights like Anthropic and OpenAI to be forced into substantially reducing their prices very soon, just to maintain their market share. Why is the pressure so high? Well, because of the second point. These giants are actively preparing for their upcoming major corporate IPOs. Wall Street demands high margins and sticky recurring revenue. They simply cannot afford to bleed tens of thousands of developers to DeepSeek right before going public. Plus, DeepSeek isn't just resting on its laurels. Their upcoming R2 model is already on the horizon, and it's expected to be even stronger, cheaper, and feature vastly improved reasoning capabilities. Ultimately, this hyper-competition ensures a massive global trend, relentlessly driving down the cost of intelligence and making AI drastically cheaper to develop, test, and deploy for absolutely everyone. Which leaves us with this final thought for today's explainer. As the world continues to pay less and less for more and more AI capability, we really have to deeply consider how this democratization is going to reshape the software industry forever. When the raw computing brainpower needed to build the future practically costs pennies, who really wins? The ultimate winners are the innovators, the builders, and the creators who can now execute their visions entirely without budget constraints. Thank you so much for joining me for this breakdown. Keep exploring and keep questioning the data.